My name is Mick Hume. I'm the editor-at-large of Spiked. I was the founding editor of Spiked when we started in 2000. I suppose the best way to describe what I've been doing for the last 35 years is I'm a propagandist, which doesn't necessarily mean you're Joseph Goebbels or a liar. It means that you are concerned with propagating ideas and arguments, and that's my thing. My new book is called Trigger Warning: Is the Fear of Being Offensive Killing Free Speech? I suppose what Trigger Warning is, I hope, is not only a reflection on the new problems to do with free speech in Anglo-American society, but it's a call to arms. It's really saying that the danger today is not that that we might lose the new free speech wars, but that we're going to not even fight them, that we're surrendering without a struggle, particularly in the UK, but I think more than is suspected in the US as well. When I was a very young man, I got involved in left-wing politics, and one of the things that I objected to about the left from the first in Britain was their opposition or their discomfort with the question of free speech. They were always much more interested in getting the state to control things. They were in letting people have freedom. That was seen as being something right-wing. So in the 1970s, the British left in the student movement adopted the no platform for fascist policies. What the no platform policy means is that if you find somebody whose opinions you object to, rather than debating with them, you no platform them, which means you basically ban them. You say that you cannot appear on a platform in this college or this institution or this media organisation. So you kind of try to bury them rather than argue against their ideas. And the idea that somehow if you can silence somebody, that's the same thing as beating them in a political debate. It's a nonsense. It was a nonsense when it was only applied to fascists and the far right in the 1970s by the British left and the student unions. Now you have a no platform policy which runs through everybody from homophobes, Islamophobes, the Sun tabloid newspaper. You know, it just goes on and on, even to the point where you have feminist speakers who've been no platformed by other feminists because they refuse to use the correct language when talking about transgender issues. So those who think of themselves as left-wing or liberal-minded in Britain have become increasingly obsessed with censorship, with no platform, with silencing those that they object to rather than arguing against them. And my point has always been that, as someone who's always supported liberation struggles, that every liberation struggle that ever succeeded always had the demand for free speech at its heart. People always understood that the ability to express yourself and make your demands was key to the achievement of emancipation and equality. Now you have a movement where activists seem to think that what people in identity groups need is protection from speech, freedom from speech, because they're so vulnerable. And I think that's a very dangerous idea. Two cases I've written about recently, which I think throw a lot of light on what's new about the free speech wars today. One is the case of an evangelical pastor from North Belfast who is facing a jail sentence, possibly of up to 6 months, for giving a sermon in which he expressed the honestly held evangelical belief that Islam is satanic. And so I've written in defence of his right to free speech. The other is a case in Scotland where a supporter of the Rangers Football Club, which is the Protestant side of the Great Divide, two strong communities which are one Protestant unionist, the other Catholic Irish nationalist, and they were represented by the football clubs. He was sent to jail for 4 months this year in our 800th anniversary of Magna Carta for singing a song called The Billy Boys, which includes the words, "We're up to our knees in Fenian blood," Fenian being an old-fashioned insult for Irish rebels. He wasn't actually up to his knees in Fenian blood, he was just singing that old gory line from a sectarian football song, and he was sent to prison for 4 months. And you know, in their different ways, they really demonstrate what's going on in the free speech issue today, that people are being locked up in Britain for being offensive, not for inciting violence or for threatening, issuing direct threats, but for expressing opinions and ideas which other people find offensive, or which the authorities more likely find offensive on behalf of somebody else. So that's interesting. And what's even worse about those cases is the so-called civil liberties lobby in the UK couldn't care less about them. They're not interested in fighting for free speech for some mad Protestant firebrand preacher in Belfast or some numpty football fan from Glasgow. You know, they are interested in dissident Chinese poets and Iranian artists and so on. And the fact that if we want to defend free speech, you've got to defend it as an indivisible right, an indivisible liberty that has to be defended for all or for none at all, has been lost in this debate. So those are the kind of cases I want to really highlight, because they bring to light not only what's happening in terms of the the different kinds of attacks on free speech now, but the fact that we're not fighting back. Well, I think blasphemy laws are ridiculous, outdated, historical anachronisms. But what's interesting is in Britain, for example, we no longer have blasphemy laws. That was seen as being a great step forward where the new Labour government got rid of blasphemy laws. But what they did was introduce hate speech laws instead. So we now no longer have old-fashioned religious blasphemy laws. We have a kind of secular blasphemy laws, which says there are new taboos you're not allowed to break. There are new groups you're not allowed to offend against. And in many ways more insidious and pervasive than blasphemy ever was, which was a dead law on the statute books for most of the last 100 years. What's happening in Turkey is interesting, both because of what's happening and the reaction to it in a country like Britain. Turkey's kind of the closest thing in a democratic, almost Western society to old-fashioned government censorship. You have a government in Turkey which thinks that its job and responsibility is to switch off Twitter and the internet when it gets too cheeky, like a parent switching off the radio to stop their children hearing a naughty language. So it's a kind of strange combination of old-fashioned authoritarian government and new technology. So it's interesting and it's dangerous. But what's also interesting is the reaction to it from people like in Britain, because civil liberty activists in Britain and other European countries love talking about something like Turkey because it's simple, it's a government with a big boot smashing free speech. We can object to that, that's easy. What they find much more difficult to deal with closer to home are the more kind of insidious, backdoor, culture of conformism kind of issues that we're dealing with here. So it becomes much easier to talk about state repression in Turkey than it does to talk about the you can't say that culture in Britain. When we talk about cases that we think the world should know about, one of the things that I'm very concerned about is that we've forgotten so much of the history of the struggle for free speech and why it was important in the first place. So one of the things I try and do in my book is to throw some light on some of the historical cases and examples of the fight for free speech. So one case I would like the world to remember, for example, particularly in today's context, is that of Frederick Douglass, the former slave who became an anti-slavery campaigner, and who in the 1860s wrote a fantastic pamphlet called A Plea for Free Speech in Boston, after his anti-slavery meeting was smashed up by what he called a mob of gentlemen in that fine city. And Douglass made the point very powerfully that free speech was the key to defeating slavery, that 6 months of free speech would smash every chain in the South, and that free speech had to be upheld for everybody as a double right, the right to express yourself and the right to hear everything and judge for yourself. And that is such a powerful lesson down the years at a time which seems to have been forgotten by all of those who are so concerned about liberation and equality now, who seem to think that somehow you can liberate yourself by banning other people from expressing themselves. So that's one case I would like the world to remember. The reason that I think trigger warnings are important is that they are a kind of symbol of the you can't say that, you shouldn't hear that culture, which is the most insidious kind of threat to freedom of expression. The big threat we deal with today is not, jackbooted political censorship. It's this culture of conformism and you can't say that. And I think trigger warnings are a useful symbol of understanding that. They are, as many of your audience will know, something which really took off on American campuses and have crossed the Atlantic and gone around the internet now. They are a warning put at the front of any piece of writing or video to say, this is something that you might not want to look at because it contains offensive material you may find offensive or upsetting or traumatizing. And what's interesting was it began as something dealing with, on websites dealing with people with mental health issues that was supposed to warn them of something which might, if they'd been a victim of sexual violence, and they saw some sexual violence, it might trigger a traumatic episode. Experts will tell you that's actually a pretty nonsensical way of understanding the trauma anyway. But even so, in those terms, at least it was attempting to make sense of something. Now we seem to be in a situation where, reading Huckleberry Finn can be the equivalent of having a traumatic exposure to sexual violence, which I think is a nonsense. But for me, what trigger warnings are, they're like the equivalent of, on those old maps you used to see of the world, on the uncharted bits, they'd say, here be dragons. Don't go there, don't step off the edge, too dangerous. And that's what trigger warnings are about. And so they are a symbol of what's happening in our culture that's very dangerous. So the next step is, well, we shouldn't be teaching these scripts. And of course, that is what's now being argued by many of these so-called trigger warning warriors. I'm always optimistic because I think history shows that what you think about free speech reflects what you think about humanity. And when humanity has faith in itself, then it believes in freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And when it loses faith in itself, free speech and freedom of the press go out of fashion. Today, free speech and freedom of the press are most definitely out of fashion. But I think, if we're going to have faith in the future, we've got to fight for free speech as the voice of humanity.